Morning, everybody. It's day 3. It's Wednesday. We may have just impeached our president. It's going to be a weird day. It's going to be 94 degrees. Thanks for coming. What I'm realizing is that pretty much the only universal gift we have to give each other is time, and I really appreciate you spending yours with me. So I'm Ian, for those of you who don't know me, and this is a story in 2 parts. It's a smaller audience. Do some questions at the end. But there's 2 parts to this problem. The first part is thinking a little bit about the platform we provide as professionals to our enterprises. So if we think about what we see in the press, we hear a lot about security and privacy, right? These 2 disciplines have an enormous amount of airtime. There's a dramatic tension between the 2 of them, and for good reason, right? We know both of these disciplines. But if you look at something like the General Data Protection Regulation, what you find is that, for sure, there are some security requirements, right? Encryption, having a security program. These are all, security requirements. And if you look at the regulation, there are some very clear privacy requirements. Privacy by design, privacy by default, your relationship with data protection officers, okay? But here's the thing. Right to rectification, do not process, consent. These parts of GDPR, they're not privacy requirements, and they're not really security requirements. The reality is these are identity requirements. The tool set you need to solve these problems are identity tools. But the thing about that is, in that regard, when you only hear a lot about security and privacy, we're missing that 3rd leg of the stool, right? We're missing the other support for our IT programs, which is our identity capabilities. Think about it differently. When you talk to your peers internally, identity is the human interface for security. If you strip out identity from our security controls, what you have is a lot of boring logs that don't give you context. Right? Identity provides the context to our security controls and makes them real. Similarly, identity is the operational arm for privacy, right? Especially if you look at access to data requirements, right? Governing who has access to what data. Clearly, privacy speaks to this as a requirement, but the operational control we deploy, more often than not, is an identity control. So identity becomes this partner to both security and privacy. But we're not always, as a profession, we're not always the go-to to get the answer or the go-to to get the control into the deployment. And that bugs me. And I've been thinking about this problem for a while. And what I'm realizing is, in many organizations of really any size, identity's voice is often not always heard. They're not always at the decision-making table. Now, part of the reason is, this little puzzle, which is, if I'm a security professional, I can go to ISACA, and I can get a certification, get CISSP through IC². Okay. And if I'm a privacy professional, I go to IAPP, I can get my CIPP, I can get a certification, and I have a professional organization in the form of the International Association of Privacy Professionals to learn more. But as an identity management professional, as an identity professional, we don't have a professional organization. So in that regard, we're professionals without a profession. And that's really strange, given that, at least according to one industry analyst firm, just consumer identity, right? So not the whole of identity management, but just consumer identity is going to be a 20 billion euro market by 2020. But we don't have a professional organization. So I've been thinking about these questions for a while, and this is the one I start with, which is, how did you learn identity management? In my case, I got a vendor manual. I was handed the Access 360 Enroll 3.0 install guide. I didn't know I was learning user provisioning. I was learning a product. And then I learned more general provisioning. And then I learned about access certification. And then I learned about request. And then I learned about federation. And that process keeps going. And I think many of you are probably the same way. And think about how long that takes. Certainly, Steve would say that I'm still learning. So that's 17 years in this industry, and I'm still trying to figure this stuff out. But if I'm starting with new college graduates, I'm trying to fill positions of how to build identity professionals. I don't have the luxury of 18 years, right? I need to get someone who's good at this discipline, good at this art, and I need to do it quickly. And I've been thinking about how we collectively grow this industry, right? It's already a growing industry from a financials perspective, but I'm thinking about it more along the lines of, like, how do we make this a more equitable industry? How do we make sure that more people have an opportunity to give back more to each other, and in doing so, strengthen the services we deliver to our enterprises? So these kinds of questions have been rattling around in my head for about 2 years. And in late 2015, I sat down with my friends at the Kantara Institute initiative and started thinking about, hey, are you seeing these things? Are these questions bugging you too? And what came from that was a concept we call ID Pro. We have been working on forming a professional organization to serve identity professionals, to give them a place to grow, to give them a place to give back, give them a place to develop their skills. So in May of 2016, I announced this at the European Identity Conference. And, hey, we got this idea. What do people think? In just a couple months after that, we had about 400 people step up and say, yeah, there's something here. I think there's some value here. I want to contribute in some capacity. About 100 of those, so a quarter of those, participated a little bit more deeply. They actually signed on to Kantara to work on ID Pro. And their work broke down into 3 work streams. Essentially, membership services. What are we going to give the membership? A code of conduct. Essentially, without being a profession, we don't actually have a code of ethics for being an identity professional. I think it's really important, given the nature of the data that we handle, that we have a code of conduct. And the third thing is a body of knowledge. This is the tricky one. See, here, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but if I take any 2 of you and I put you in a room and I give you one identity topic to talk about, there will be 4 opinions. It's just what we do. Like, we always go over and over and over again definitions and meaning. Well, what that means is, if you're new to the profession, it's really friggin' hard to learn the profession because we don't have a body of knowledge I can point someone to. At best, I can point you to some vendor manuals, I can point you to a couple blogs, and then a bunch of tweets about my socks. Like, that's not really a corpus of knowledge. I don't think it works. So what have you been working on? So from a membership perspective, we're going to have individual and corporate memberships. And so this is applicable for sole practitioners, nonprofits, large organizations, small organizations. From a services perspective, there's a lot of things we want to do. What we're going to do in the shorter term is probably monthly newsletters with long-form articles on practice, right? How do you run a good continuous certification program? That's the kind of thing that people, even if they're doing some of it, can always learn a little bit more about, right? So as an example of one of the topics. We'd like to have a daily news clipping service because there's a lot going on in the industry in all parts of it. I think one of the great things about this conference has been that the world of traditional IAM and identity proofing, those sets of professionals don't always get to mingle, aren't always aware of what the other's doing. And I think just a small daily feed of, like, hey, news that you probably can use. We want to have digital forums where people can interact. This, to me, is probably the most important value. The ability to meet peers in your industry and talk about how they solve problems that you're having. Right. In the course of doing ID Pro at Kantara, we discovered a couple of things. One of them around this need for networking in the physical world. We discovered there is no physical meetup of identity professionals in all of Germany. Okay, it's like the 4th largest economy in the world, and you're telling me the identity professionals there, of which there are many really, really good ones, they don't get together anytime. They don't even realize it. These are small things we can do to actually make us a stronger industry, right? To say, look, hey, we're going to have this meetup in Seattle of the Women in Identity are hosting it, and you all should come out and check it out because if nothing else, you get to raise a glass with a friend. someone who can help you do your job better. For the code of practice, there's two sections to this. There's a section on professionalism, essentially what we expect of identity professionals. And there is also a personal integrity section. We handle really sensitive information. Even if you're just doing traditional IAM, employee data, it's really sensitive information. And we're the keeper of the keys for access. And so in this regard, I think it's important to have a statement about what we believe in the way we should manage and ethically handle that data. And lastly, the body of knowledge. This is a longer-term project because if you start out on the mission to catalog identity information or just the kinds of identity disciplines, so authentication and authorization, et cetera, that's a big task. So what we've been building is a taxonomy of identity information. And we've then broken that into layers. So from an operational layer, what do I need to know around authentication? From a governance layer, what do I need to know around authentication? From a programmatic management perspective, right? So what we're trying to do is build a structure to manage and categorize information about our industry. What we will then be doing is providing reference material for all of that. And then beyond that, writing narrative to help stitch it all together. So the goal, again, this is a little bit longer term, is to have a body of knowledge that someone who you've just hired into your enterprise, you can say, look, you're going to be working on our identity governance programs. Let's start here. I want you to focus on access request first, because that's the first project we have. And they can learn in a vendor neutral way faster than they could if they were on their own. And this is setting up for certifications. So I'd like to, at some point in the future, have a certification program where I can actually be a certified identity architect or certified identity program manager. There's a variety of flavors this could come in. To me, it's important to have a meaningful certification, right? I think we all remember the days when you could go get your MCSE and you still didn't really know how to use Active Directory. That's not very valuable. Versus, back in the day, there was a Cisco certification. You had to pay $10,000 to take. They brought you to San Jose, and you had to build the network there. And they questioned everything you did about that. And then they said, go home. You go away back to the hotel that night, and they break it. And the next day, you have to come in and fix it. It's pretty damn grueling. But when you came out of that, you were assured you knew your stuff. So I think part of the challenge ID Pro is going to have is building a certification that has teeth, that's meaningful. And we'll be working towards that. So where do we stand? Soon, for short definitions of soon, we will likely be incorporating as an entity. Right now, we're being incubated by Kantara, but we're going to strike out our own very shortly. So I'd ask, keep tabs on us, because probably by the middle of June, the doors are going to be open for founding memberships. And that's going to be a pretty neat gold star to have on your resume, which is I was there at the beginning to help form this thing. Second part of the story. So let's now imagine we are all identity professionals formally. Yay. There's something that's going on with our data and our systems that worry me. Going back to the code of practice in ID Pro, inside of it is a spirit of do no harm. Because we handle really sensitive information. And I think it's safe to say that everybody in this room, no one wants to build a system that can harm themselves, right? Or harm others, right? This is not what we do, right? We want to make sure the tools we're building, the services we're offering, are productive. They're delivering service. Thing about it is, your identity system, if it's a value to you, it is a value to an attacker. Guaranteed. So let's talk about those attackers. There are two flavors, bulk attackers and single row attackers. So bulk attackers, well, as the name implies, they want all the data. Now, why they want all the data? Variety of reasons. Okay, they may want to set up a spear phishing attack later on. So they need a quick harvest of a lot of data to get going. They may want to identify everyone who shares a genetic marker, an employer, an ethnic heritage. There's a variety of reasons why bulk attackers want this large swath of longitudinal data. These are just some of them. Now, the second kind of attacker is a single row attacker. They are interested in a single data subject. Okay. Again, there is a variety of different motivations for a single row attacker. They may want to mess with a political opponent. They may want to take over your phone so they can harvest 2FA. It's SMS OTPs, for example. They want to stalk an ex-spouse. There's a variety of reasons why single row attackers do what they do. Thing is, however, there is in fact a third kind of attacker. This attacker is a little different. If you're this guy, this attacker looks like this guy. If you're me, this attacker looks like her. So that's Alexa. She is the newest member on my product management team. She's pretty new to product management. She's reasonably new to identity. Thing about it is, she is unbelievably smart. And I know a little more training, a little more seasoning, a little more conversations with customers, she will have all the skills she needs to replace me. And that's my job, is to make sure I'm producing product managers who can replace me. I'm super excited for it, too. So this third kind of attacker is the person that has your job next. I call them successor attackers. And the thing about successor attackers is they just want to do their job. And they have very straightforward motivations, like they like to continue to get paid. And sometimes those motivations aren't quite as obvious. Maybe they're going to get a payment under the table for their access to some of your identity systems. And remember, these are the ones that you built and you curated, but now they have your chair. And they probably have your rights. You see, the thing about successor attackers is they look suspiciously like compromised users, except there's some subtle differences. So any of these attackers can weaponize our identity systems. They can take these great systems for delivery of service to citizens, to consumers, to our enterprise, and they can use them to cause harm. And I think if we're now all professionals, we got to step up here, because we can't allow that to happen. Right? We did not put blood, sweat, and tears into our identity systems and services to have this happen. So this is going to require not just identity professionals, but it has to start with us. And if for no other reason, then all of our stakeholders expect this. Whether it's internal or external, there is an expectation that you have some information about me, and you damn well better do right by me because of it. So I think we actually have to de-weaponize our identity systems. And we'll explain about what that means in a second. But I had 4 goals coming up with this concept. First is we had to defeat, or at least defend successfully against, all 3 types of attackers. Second thing is I have to keep the lights on. So I still have to be productive, but I want to protect the data better. There's tension there. The third thing I want to do is I would like to have greater transparency over who's using my identity systems. I happen to have the luxury of working for a very transparent organization, one might say radically so. And there's a lot of interesting behavior that comes out of being in such an organization. I think it's a value for our identity systems. And the fourth is a little pet project of mine going back many, many years. Promoting data provenance. In our lives, personal and professional, we make decisions too often based on data where we don't know where the data came from. See above, alt facts. This happens, but it's kind of crazy, right? If you're going to make an important risk-based decision and you don't know where the data on which you're making that decision comes from, that's a little scary. So I think we can do better here. So what do we need from a skill set to de-weaponize our identity systems? Well, obviously, we're going to need some core identity capabilities. Governance, access control. That's no surprise. But we're going to need a couple of other disciplines. We're going to need data protection to be involved. We're going to need the folks that are running audit for us and the people that are running our data services to help us. So what I've been working on, what I've been presenting for the last couple of months is a maturity model for de-weaponizing identity systems. So like all good maturity models, it has 5 levels. Like all good arrays, it starts at 0. And 0 is the baseline for your enterprise. How you today protect a system commensurate with its data classification. Okay? So think of this as your baseline protections. The next 5 levels are optimizations we can make to our security controls, our data protection programs, optimized for identity systems. Let's walk through this. So level 1 is just manage, basically get our arms around the problem. This, I believe, is table stakes. This is the beginning of an optimization to our security programs. And I think it helps with things like GDPR. I'm not going to say that it solves all the problems, but it helps. So here we have 3 basic disciplines we need: access, data protection, and audit. From an access perspective, some of these aren't too surprising. 2-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication for admins, not a big surprise. No developer access to production. As people have pointed out to me, yeah, but we're doing DevOps, so developers are in production. So I think we have to make this more nuanced, which is to say no developer access to production data, but you can have access to production compute. But that third one, no program lead access to production. That's the one that doesn't get enough airtime. I thought about this myself. I'm like, Ian, what can you do in production? The answer is nothing. And that's the right answer. But we don't often think about our program leads in our identity programs and the access that they have as an explicit call out in terms of what am I going to protect. Data protection, excuse me. Data protection, these things are pretty much mom and apple pie. Nothing too surprising there. The one that tends to trip up people is insecure data staging. It's like, yeah, we encrypted it all the way to that TFTP site. Crap. And then audit basics here, right? Audit all admin system changes, not a big deal, and audit all access. Again, level 1, manage, get your arms around the problem. Level 2, let's go after successor attackers. Let's protect against ourselves. In doing so, we can protect against rogue admins, we can protect against compromised users, and we begin to mitigate threats from adjacent systems. I'll show you what I mean in a sec. So dust off our segregation of duties tools, right? We had a lot of fun doing Sarbanes-Oxley. Boy, that was a blast doing SOD, woohoo. But I think we need to really focus these things back on our admins, because we should never be giving an admin a read all and modify all. Frankly, you shouldn't give them either, in my opinion. But it's time to take our SOD tools and start pointing them at people like ourselves and our admins. The other thing is I worry about integration users. I worry about adjacent systems that are touching our identity systems. And I believe one of the things we need to do is actually explicitly delegate access to those adjacent systems. So no carte blanche integration user. We want specifically assigned access. And so that means that we've got a greater control over what's touching our systems from a service integration perspective. And then lastly, selectively, that's the key word here, encrypt and hash as needed. So let's up our game in terms of classic data protection, optimized for identity systems. Level 3, let's go after bulk attackers. Bulk attackers are a little tricky because actually the better way to defeat them runs up against one of the principles, which is productivity. I'll show you what I mean. I believe for large extracts, and we'll put large in quotes, we should have a 2-person rule. Okay. Now this could be on paper, but if I'm going to move data from an operational identity system into our data lake, I'd like 2 people's signatures on that. Right? I want to know it's a good idea to commingle this information or move this information from one classification of system to another. So let's introduce a 2-person rule here. Again, this could be a paper control. It'd be great if it was an automated one. And what I'd like to do is think a little bit more about query governors. And this can run up against productivity, I know. But the thing is, for the vast swath of people in most of our identity systems, there's low volume access, right? I need a couple hundred records at a time. tens of thousands seems weird. So let's put a query governor in place and then have exception processes on that. At this point, also, we should really be knowing who's touching all the data. So audit all CRUD operations. Level 4. Let's go after the single row attacker. These are the most difficult attackers to defeat, partially because they're data nerds. They know mortgage payments to the penny. At best, we know them to the dollar. And that comes up in a second. See, because here's the thing. Some of us still are using knowledge-based authentication. Okay, not great. Tolerable under some circumstances. Problem is when you ask KBA questions whose answer is part of the data set that's being asked. But it's not the core focus of the data set. It's just some ancillary information that you use to power KBA. It's the kind of thing that a data nerd knows. Because they did a bulk extract over here to get one piece of fact that then they can use to be a single row attacker somewhere else. So general practice, if you can't get rid of KBA, please, please, please do not ask KBA questions whose answers live in their own data set. That is just asking for trouble. And this is a place where I think we can ask a little bit more of data management and data services in terms of machine learning. I'm going to ease into this, but behavioral query governors or behavioral query observers, I think, are realistic in the sense to say, yeah, it's typical for Ian to do these kinds of queries and get this many rows returned. It is super weird if he now has all of these where clauses, which is identifying a single subject as a for instance. So I think this is a place where we can lean on our data services teams a little bit more to say, let's up our intelligence here. Level 5. This is my transparency nirvana. Want to do two things here. One, I want to do this thing I'm calling the flip the panopticon, where I get to observe who's looking at information. I'll explain in a little bit more detail. And the other thing is really start to promote data provenance. So from a audit perspective, making who's querying information public has really interesting side effects. Now, public is going to vary depending on jurisdiction and industry and whatnot, but even if you just did it in your own company, to know, oh, if you're going to go hit the customer system and query it, know that that is publicly accessible within our four walls. That's behavior changing. Now, to be sure, it can also have a chilling effect, right? It can also cause, I think, some people that are trying to do the right thing from doing anything. But I also believe there's some really interesting behavioral change where it's like, oh, look, everyone who queries, say, passport issuance information, that's FOIA-able. Oh, that's a real interesting change in behavior, potentially. So it's something that I want to at least play with, which is the idea of if I can now greater expose who's looking at information, I believe social norms kick in to actually change behavior. The other part of this is around data provenance. We make risk-based decisions on data where we don't know where the data comes from. And when you think about that, it's a little scary, right? So I wrote about this years ago when I was an analyst, relationship context metadata, a way of binding metadata into data. And there are a couple of organizations that I know that do this today, where they embed what is the source of this information? What are the conditions under which we can use this information into the data itself? Because this way, at least we begin to have a chance to better protect that information when we see it. So a little bit more around provenance and knowing where our data comes from. I think we do this implicitly. We say like, oh, well, this data load function is an HR function. Okay. But it's not explicit. So when the next hop of that data happens, we don't know where it goes. So this model is not done. I know that. Right? But it's a start. And it's meant to be a start in addition to what we already do in terms of our security controls in an enterprise. Right? These are identity-centric optimizations for data protection, for our security programs. It's a way that we can start to commensurate with classification, optimize how we protect some of the most sensitive information in our enterprises. And in that way, it's how we do no harm. Right? By doing de-weaponization activities, by going through this maturity model, this is how we really live the spirit of doing no harm. So where do we go next? Well, a couple things. We always have to meet our stakeholders' expectations. And I believe in this case, it's about being a good custodian. Right? It's being the person who and the program who can protect information well and sensitive to the kinds of information that it is. So to that end, I believe as a profession, we need to take steps to de-weaponize our identity systems. Short term, I think most organizations can get to level 1 in 6 months. I think it's realistic. You're probably already there in many cases. I think you probably want to do a quick audit of developer access to production data versus compute. And you probably want to take a look at your program leads and what they can do. But I bet we can get there, 6 months. Level 2 in 12 months. I don't think this is really unrealistic, right? So if we get to level 2, we have mitigated a little bit more about compromised admins. We've put a little bit more friction in processes where it's appropriate. But I think it's realistic to get to level 2 in about a year's time. And what I'd really like as well is for you to keep tabs on ID Pro. All of us in the room can benefit from the professionalization of the industry. Whether we're individual practitioners or corporations, we're vendors. The opportunity here is to give a multi-billion-dollar industry a formal voice, a formal place where people can come together to give back and to learn from one another. I think that's extremely valuable. And by doing so, then we provide a balanced platform for our enterprises to put all of their IT programs upon. Right? When used in equal measure, security, privacy, and identity provide this stable platform for every digital engagement opportunity, every digital program. And that's really what professionalization is about, is working towards being that third leg of the stool and serve our enterprises and our customers the best. And so with that, thank you so much for your attention. I will take questions. You can go to that mic. We'll stand right next to each other and talk into the mics together. It'll be awesome. It'll be awkward at all.
Neil Wasserman from Time Wave Analytics. Anyway, I applaud your effort to continue the theme that I think was started by Edward Snowden in his question, is what you can do, what you should do. And that pertains to many technologies, robotics and the one that you bring. I was involved in policy development in the Navy IT organizations for a long time. And one of the things that I noticed was that the culture was really about defining goals. I mean, policy defined a set of requirements that are kind of objectives. But there was a gap between defining the written policy and the behaviors that actually engaged that policy and changed the culture and practice of the organization. And so the question I would have for you is, what set of regular behaviors, things that occur every day, every week, every month, would be associated with implementing the kind of policy goals that you're defining? How do you translate the goals into the actual operational culture of the organization?
That's a really nice question. It's really meaty. So back when I was an analyst, I would talk about, first off, making sure you actually had a set of principles defined for the enterprise, because principles yield to practice, right? If we don't have a core set of values and we don't actually have principles about these are the things, how we define, how we manage our information, and then we have no chance of yielding to practice of how we'd actually do that. So I very much get what you say. I think it comes in probably two flavors. The first being there are just the awareness of, hey, this set of information in this identity service does this job. This is what we've explained it to be doing. But it could be used in another way. We don't spend enough time thinking about how information we manage can be used in another way. I think that's something we can learn from privacy professionals, right? When privacy professionals do privacy impact assessments, and they think about this as like, okay, so what's the purpose of collection? Blah, 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 blah. And what's the purpose of the service? Great, this is great. Well, yeah, but what if we just looked at this data as someone with maybe less moral backbone than we have? What if we look at this data from what happens if we lose it? Right? This is kind of typical PIA processes. We need that in identity management, right? We need that sort of daily, just even if it's a breath, a momentary like, okay, I'm going to add this attribute around whether I proofed the person was a veteran, right? Because it's going to power these business processes. We got permission to collect it. This is really valuable both for us and for the veteran because we're going to give them great services. Okay, but in combination with what else we have in this system, what does this do? Right. Just that momentary pause as we were working with our systems, I think is valuable because it inserts a moment for us to do the right thing, I think. So we don't have those moments. We're not trained to think about, well, all I got, think about this. I go work on like a directory. So I walked up to Active Directory. I've got 3 chickens and 5 black candles because I'm going to work on the schema. And I'm thinking about getting my job done. I'm supposed to add this attribute, is veteran, and then a date when verified. That's what I'm going to go do, right? And that's the task we had. But that momentary pause before you light the 5th candle and say, well, hang on a minute. What else can this information be used with in combination with the other attributes that's in this system? Oh, but wait a minute. Are we also combining attributes from a federated source when we then work with this integration? Just that pause is an enormous daily practice. Second thing, I don't think we, as a practice, stick up for our attributes as well as we could, right? We let security or we let privacy in a lot of ways try to be the catch-all here. Either it's because data classification and protections commensurate with that, or we did a PIA. But as an identity professional, I think the practice here of saying is, I would like to have a little bit more rigor around what my attributes mean to my business stakeholders and to their stakeholders. I want to have a little bit more rigor around understanding what these attributes mean in combination. I want to know a little bit more rigor around when these attributes transit borders, what does it mean? This kind of set of questions, it's not the kind of thing that necessarily gets captured in our privacy impact assessment. And it's not really something that gets captured in a vulnerability assessment. It's this other thing that we as identity professionals don't really have a language for this kind of analysis. That's a practice I'd like to work on. So I'm going to pause there. Other questions?
Pick up where you left off.
Sweet, because if not, I was going to call on Jim because he was late to the presentation. So.
I'm Jamie Becklin from JanRain. I think this is really meaningful work. And I also have some concerns for the people in this room, for the people in this space, right? Because what you're suggesting, well, and in fact, what you said at the end really gets to a very fundamental question, which is, understanding the business impact in a world and in an ecosystem where oftentimes what I see is that the people in this space, in their organizations, struggle a lot with having a seat at the table for those business conversations in the first place. So some of what I see is you suggesting that that's a problem that we have to lean into as an industry. But if we're sort of seen as, hey, now we want to think harder and longer and deeper about what these attributes are, what they're used for, what the provenance is, then the risk is that we're further seen as blockers. So is this a go slow to go fast kind of suggestion?
So a couple things on that. One is there's a little bit of chicken and egg, right? Which is if we don't already have a seat at the table, or worse, we are represented through someone other's proxy. Like classic is, this CISO organization represents the identity team. That works if you've got an enlightened CISO organization, but for the most part, those are the guys that came from if it's not layer 2 or 3, they don't want to know about it, and that doesn't serve identity well, right? Because as identity professionals and architects, we provide that human context back into the security conversation. So if you have a proxy representing you, it's like, yeah, of course I can do the plumbing. Yeah, of course I can move those attributes. Yay, standards, right? That's kind of the conversation. That's not valuable to the organization. On the other hand, if we're seen as sort of blockers, then we're absolutely not going to get a seat at the table. So it's more about, one, being able to clearly express in, let's say, a consumer or citizen identity service, the fact that identity is the on-ramp for all digital engagement. Right? You can't do omni-channel digital engagement without identity because we provide the important context for our apps, for our services, for our connected devices, for our people. And so in that regard, we are not the stars of customer identity show. No, we're a side dish, but we're a really important side dish. More actually like salt, to be honest. And so the conversation with digital teams, with sales and marketing, with lines of business are, we provide you this on-ramp to the kind of engagement that the brochureware has promised you, right? We allow you this way to center the business around the customer, around the citizen. Being able to express that message with certainty is what I think we have to do. Because in doing that, in learning that message, we're seen as, oh, these are the guys that get me to engagement faster. These are the guys that get me to multi-channel experience faster. These are the women that help me do this and respect the customer and deliver more service. I want those people at this table. So I think part one is talking about outcomes and understanding our relationship in digital engagement. I think that's what's going to dominate us for the next couple of years as an industry. And the second thing is we absolutely have to have strong alliances with our CISO organizations because they're still going to proxy us in many conversations. But even if it's every other day, go into the CISO organization and be like, so you know we're not just Active Directory, right? Right? We can do other stuff. No, not the 2FA thing. No, we can do it better than that. We make sure that all of our people get to the stuff they need quickly, right? I work for Salesforce. We have a lot of salespeople. The one thing that like everyone loves, and people in this room are going to laugh, is like it's single sign-on, right? Because I have thousands of salespeople and typing in credentials, which is just, it's a time suck for them. They're on a mobile device. They just want to get their jobs done. And so the little things that we have always done, but we don't put value on because they're boring to us. Like there is nothing more boring than a single sign-on demo. Well, that's not true. The new hotness and boring is a single logout demo. It's hot. I'm telling you, that's where the world is. But when we sit around with the other engineers and other product managers and we're like, oh great, and they're logged out. Yay, here's a log entry. Here's the thing about that. Like those little things can be expressed in value to our enterprise. If we talk about the outcomes that we're getting for people, that's a way of flipping the conversation so that this is not just like, oh, those are the directory monkeys over there and I don't need to talk to them, right? That's what we want to get out of the position of being in. Mr. Wilson.
This could be a one-word answer or it could be the start of a coffee conversation. Who should the C identity officer report to?
So for recording, the fine gentleman from Australia asked, so where should the, for lack of a better word, chief identity officer or the identity team, let's say, roll up to? I've had people I've talked to who have an identity team that lives inside of HR. Physical body reaction, that's an interesting one, right? So, because it makes sense. Like, what was our traditional job? People come in, get them stuff, get them paid, get them doing stuff. That seems like HR. Except HR violently rejected that organ transplant. Like that did not work out. I've got plenty of people I talk to and customers I talk to who the identity team rolls up in the CISO organization and in security. It's fine, but like we're the smallest kid on the kickball team if that's the case, right? We don't necessarily have in, I would say, many security organizations that kind of clout. However, there are plenty of people I talk to who are in security organizations and they have the proper seat at the table because the chief information security officer maybe has a privacy background as well, maybe has a line of business background as well. And they go, hang on a minute. If I want to keep my job and I want to be seen as a service provider inside the enterprise, then I understand already the balance of security, identity, and privacy, and I'm going to be a proponent for that. I think that is the wave of CISOs we are starting to see, and that's a great thing. There is another option, which is we embed identity professionals in lines of business. I kind of like this one. Here's why. I like the notion of a core identity team and then emissaries, essentially people who are embedded with line of business or oriented towards geography. Someone who basically speaks the language, goes native, and understands when, you know, my division in France for this product line is talking about digital engagement. This is the language they use, and this is the needs that they have. And here's all the identity stuff that they have no idea they're talking about, but they're talking about it. So I think we have to send emissaries into the wilds of our enterprises to really be a guide, to say, like, yeah, that's great. We'll help you do that part. Here's the things you need to think about. And hey, let me bring my privacy buddy along. Let me bring my security buddy along so that we can talk to you about the fastest, safest way we get you there and serve the customer. So, Steve, it's a coffee conversation. And last week I was in Germany for the European Identity Conference, and someone looked at the deck and afterwards came back and said, "All right, so you screwed this up." I'm like, well, yeah, but could you be more specific? I said, you didn't call for a chief identity officer. There's a lot of titles that begin with a C, and increasingly the size of that C is like smaller and smaller and smaller. So I don't want to sort of devalue what we do by trying to do title inflation. Right? It doesn't serve anyone the right thing. I would rather be an identity business analyst who's just trusted by this product line, because they're the ones who say, like, oh, well, that connected product that you want to do in 18 months, let me show you how you're going to get an omni-channel experience out of that off of mobile. Right? That's a conversation that identity professionals should be having and confident in having. It's really value add, more so than having some fancy pants title for an identity organization. I think we should probably centralize under CISO, enlighten them, and have embedded emissaries in lines of business. Okay, it's break time. I'm happy to hang around, but thank you so much. This was fun.